Nothing more fascinates people than people. People need people. We're born to belong, to connect. Social connections enabled our ancestors' survival. Whether hunting game or building shelter, 10 hands were better than 2. And so for people everywhere, including the folks in this airport, connections matter. Separation evokes loss. In exile or in solitary confinement, we yearn for our own people and places. Reconnecting triggers joy. We are, said Aristotle, the social animal. We are made for social connection. Our lives are connected by 1,000 invisible threads, wrote the novelist Herman Melville. By carefully observing people in natural and controlled environments, we social psychologists aim to illuminate those threads. Social psychology, the science of how we view and affect one another, shines its light on persuasion and belief, conformity and independence, love and hate. With painstaking observations and clever experiments, it offers partial answers to some big questions regarding how we think about, how we influence, and how we relate to one another. Some of the great researchers and great experiments have illuminated and untangled the threads of social thinking, social influence, and social relations. Consider, for example, how culture shapes our thinking. Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama have explored how our culture shapes our sense of self, which then influences how we think and how we act. Their work reveals how our social worlds bend us toward me thinking or toward we thinking. Is our identity something personal and individual, or is it more defined by our connections with others? Are we more focused on our personal achievements and rights, or on our group's goals and our social responsibilities?
For Americans in particular, middle-class Americans, this idea that I am, in the beginning, first and foremost, an individual, is, I think, what sets America, in some ways, apart from a lot of the rest of the world.
Our social thinking also seeks to make sense of the world. People make it their business to explain other people, and social psychologists make it their business to explain people's explanations. Whether we attribute someone's behavior to something external or internal matters greatly. Is this homeless person out of a job and deserving of my compassion, or just lazy? Is this woman shoving through the theater line rude, or is there some emergency? When attributing behavior, people often commit what Lee Ross considers the fundamental attribution error.
It's important to realize that the fundamental attribution error, when we talk about it, we're making a kind of generalization, and it's easy to get confused about what that generalization means. It isn't a statement that people always fail to appreciate the power of the situation. It isn't a statement that personality is never as important as the situation. It's not about any of those things. What makes the fundamental attribution error fundamental is the task that's involved. Namely, we're doing the fundamental task that lay psychologists do, trying to make sense of the world and trying to know when we've learned something about actors and when we haven't.
Nothing is closer to the heart of social psychology than social influence, people affecting people. And no idea is more basic to the discipline than this, that our social behavior reflects both our social thinking and the influence of the surrounding situation. Sometimes, as shown by experiments on conformity and obedience, the enormous power of the situation can override people's inner inclinations. Faced with powerful situations, most people are capable of acting kindly or brutally, independently or submissively. Ervin Staub, a social psychologist who survived the Holocaust, understands.
The only thing that justifies tremendous harm in my mind is defending oneself or one's family or other people from tremendous harm. And in the case of genocide and mass killing, that's not the case. Even when others try to harm you, the response usually involves killing children, killing women, killing all kinds of people who have not been involved. And it's no way commensurate with any kind of action towards the group.
Does the power of the situation help create gender differences in dating, mating, and other social behaviors? Alice Egley believes it can. People internalize culturally defined roles. But evolutionary psychologist David Buss believes natural selection also bends the genders.
That is, the empirical predictions stemming from models within evolutionary psychology have panned out. They've led to important discoveries, for example, about homicide and about human mating strategies in ways that no other theories can successfully account for. So that combination of conceptual elegance and empirical power, I think, accounts for the tremendous explosion of evolutionary psychology in the last decade.
We do see the biological side of sex differences as very important, along with the society and the social structure. So we would contrast ourselves in this recent paper that we've written with the body of thinking about sex differences that's sometimes called social constructionism.
Social psychologists study social thinking, social influence, and finally, social relations. And what a puzzle they are. No species is capable of greater animosity or more brutal aggression towards its own members, but then none other is also capable of such profound love and self-giving compassion. Claude Steele, a prominent researcher of prejudice, has explored the corrosive power of stereotypes.
Yeah, the concept of stereotype threat, the way we've used the term anyway, refers to the experience of being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about a group that you're a part of becomes relevant. As soon as that happens, as soon as you're aware that you could be seen through the lens of a negative stereotype about a group that you're a part of, if you care about that situation, you could feel some sense of threat, that you're going to be treated in terms of that stereotype or perceived in terms of that stereotype, or in some way reduced to that stereotype.
Given our need for social connection, what happens when people feel ostracized? Does feeling ignored, excluded, shunned, or even mocked make for feelings of anxiety, anger, depression? Kipling Williams has pioneered experiments on the consequences of thwarting our need to belong.
Ostracism is the act of excluding and ignoring an individual or a group by an individual or a group. And it has a lot of names. Sometimes it's called shunning, exile, banishment. Those would be cases where you're physically removed from other people. But sometimes you're in the presence of other people, in which case you might call it the silent treatment, getting the cold shoulder. In England and in Australia, they call it being sent to Coventry. The Amish community call it Meidung, where they ostracize somebody from within their group when they violated some norm.
One last thought. Experimenting with humanly significant phenomena such as conformity, stereotype threat, and ostracism requires what social psychologists call experimental realism. We've got to give people real experiences of social pressure, threatening stereotypes, or group ostracism. But doing that under controlled conditions sometimes requires deceiving people with a plausible cover story. To protect human welfare, ethical principles developed by the American Psychological Association and the British Psychological Society urge investigators to tell potential participants enough to enable their informed consent, to protect people from harm and significant discomfort, and to debrief participants by fully explaining the experiment afterward. The participants should be repaid by having learned something about the nature of psychological inquiry and by having contributed to that never-ending quest to know ourselves. Indeed, social psychology addresses many humanly significant questions. How do our attitudes feed and get fed by our actions? What leads people sometimes to hurt and sometimes to help one another? What kindles social conflict? And how can we transform closed fists into helping hands? Answering these and other questions expands our minds And once expanded to the dimensions of a larger idea, noted Oliver Wendell Holmes, the mind never returns to its original size.